Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though they die, yet shall they live. And we know these words to be true because today we gather to give witness to our faith and to remember the life of Richard Thorpe. For death is not our final goodbye, but rather the beginning of new life. So I pray God grant you grace, that in loss you might find comfort, in sorrow, laughter, in death, resurrection. On behalf of the family, I welcome you this afternoon to the celebration of Richard's life. We acknowledge that since time began, humanity has struggled with the joy of life against the mystery of death. And so we mark the veil of death by commemorating the passing of those we love, knowing that God shares in our grief and knows the loss that we feel. But at this time, I believe God gives hope in moments like these. He's our comforter in times of trials and sadness. In John's Gospel, Jesus tells his disciples not to let your hearts be troubled. Today we gather not with troubled hearts for Richard's passing, but with joy for a life that was lived and that was shared with you throughout the years. We come together to have a place to say farewell and honor a husband, a brother, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and so much more. But we come here today not to mourn Richard's passing because he's died. Rather, we come to this moment to rejoice for a life that was lived and shared with each and every one of you in a variety of ways. To know that this is not the end, but merely a time of waiting before you see Richard whole and healthy once again in God's presence. To know that those who survive him in life will continue on with the memories that you hold in your hearts. I think Helen Keller said it best when she wrote, "What we have once enjoyed, we can never lose. All that we love deeply becomes a part of us." So may this time together enable you to acknowledge your loss while holding fast to all that you have gained, having had the privilege to know Richard. May you take this time to give thanks for his life, to say so long, but we'll see you again one day, and to offer him back into God's hands as his precious son. Though you mourn his loss, you need to not shed tears because he's gone, but smile instead that he's lived. Don't shut your eyes and hope that he'll come back, but open your eyes and see all that he has left behind. I know your hearts might feel empty because you can't see him, but I know he would want you to be filled with the love that you shared. You can remember him and grieve that he is gone, or cherish his memory and allow it to live on. On this day, I want to share with you the scriptures from the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And the beautiful words from the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. At this time, I'd like to invite you to join with me in prayer. I will begin a prayer and I will invite those who would like to share in the Lord's Prayer with me as well. But gracious God, we come to you this day to celebrate and to remember Richard Thorpe's life, to give you thanks for the joy of family, the memories that are held, for all of the things that he did and accomplished here while on this earth, while alive. We pray that you'll meet us here, that your grace might abound, to find comfort, to find peace, and an opportunity to be silent and to speak. Glorious God, as we lift our prayer to you, may we together raise the prayer that your Son taught, that together we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. In 1935, America was still recovering from the effects of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, while preoccupied with news from around this world as wars and threats of war were declared. In little over a year, the Axis powers would take shape with the Rome-Berlin Pact. Japan and China were about to go to war, the Spanish Civil War was on the horizon, and King Edward VIII would soon abdicate his throne from England. Here in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president. The Hoover Dam was completed. The postage stamp cost 3 cents, gasoline 10 cents, and rent was a whopping $22 a month. That was a different time back then. Throughout the year, the world was in a state of flux and international relations were quickly changing. But despite these challenging times, something great was about to happen for one couple in Terre Haute, Indiana. Something that could bring a moment of peace to their corner of the world in a time of turmoil. This gift would forever touch the hearts of many people throughout the years. For during that time, God was preparing to give a gift that was special to this world and would bring joy beyond measure for decades to come. This blessing from God would be shared in the form of a baby boy, the middle of 3 children, who was born September 28, 1935. And for nearly 80 years, his presence was enjoyed in your midst until September 16th, when God called him home. For though we know death is a natural process bringing to close this physical life, and though we understand that people must pass away, it's never easy to say goodbye to someone, especially to one that we love. Yet may we hold fast to the reality that our lives have meaning, and each of us has been given a purpose. And when our purpose is complete, I believe God too calls us home. And though we might not understand our purpose or realizing the impact and the legacy that we leave, I know that there in all things is God's grace and a love that abounds through the life that we live. And maybe, just maybe, the purpose in life is to experience God's love right where we are, while holding fast to the hope that God will never leave us there, but hold us in his loving embrace and move us forward. So we come together not in sadness that Richard has died, rather to celebrate Richard's life, because we know today is not our final goodbye. Though his earthly life has ended, we find comfort in knowing the darkness of grief is gone, as God's eternal light, which is never extinguished, will continue on in you. I'm reminded of Christ's words where he said, I am the light of the world, and those who walk in the light follow him and will never walk in darkness. And I believe Richard certainly had a light of life radiating about him. Yet his life and his light has been rejoined to God's everlasting light, which cannot be extinguished, but burns brightly within this world through you. And for this we hold fast to the hope that there is a place where there's no pain and no suffering, where we experience true joy and peace. And I believe in that place is the God of all comfort, who brings joy to our sadness, healing to our pain, comfort in our loss, and peace in our longing. And you know, I believe that Richard is probably walking the streets of gold right now, reunited with his sister Mary Elizabeth, enjoying the lilies of the valley and the morning doves. And he might even be reminding the angels from time to time, "Saddle up, troops, daylight's a-burning." And I believe God meets us here as well, because we all struggle with pain and suffering at some point in life, especially when we face the reality of death and the reality of our mortality. And I know when faced with this reality of losing people, especially those we love, we have questions that arise at death. Questions that touch every one of our hearts that often go unanswered. And though we might not always know the answer, there is one who does. The one who can bring light out of the darkness and who can heal a heart that is hurting. One who can bring peace and calm in a troubled world. A peace that God promised both now and for eternity. So today, may we honor Richard's life and his memory, and maybe even share a laugh or two together, because I believe that's what he would have wanted. As we celebrate his life and his memory, how can we truly sum up in a brief moment together nearly 80 years of life? How can we touch on every detail, the impact that Richard has had on so many of you? There's so much to think about, stories to share, the memories that you carry with you, the big and the small ways that he touched your life and touched your hearts throughout your life, the experiences you shared, the laughs, the hugs, the I love yous. Each of you needs a moment to remember Richard. So I'll say it again. We gather today not because he's gone, but because he lived. And his life was shared with each and every one of you for nearly 80 years, even though you'll know it never seemed long enough. Tom Brokaw once called Richard's generation the greatest generation any society has ever produced for all that they lived through. And Richard was truly one of the greatest. You see, I think being born in his time and living for all of those years, Richard really did experience a lot of life, both good and bad times. Over the span of his life, he experienced World War II, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. He saw 13 presidents take office. He saw the U.S. move from 48 to 50 states. He witnessed the advancement in travel from simple roadways to major freeways, from limited commercial airlines to space travel to walking on the moon and the Mars rover. From party lines to iPhones, a time without television to jumbotrons. Yet I would say this is what made Richard so unique, because all of the history that he lived through, and just by his very nature. Richard Thorpe was born Saturday, September 28, 1935, in West Terre Haute, Indiana. As a child growing up in a small town in the Midwest, Richard spent most of his school days attending Wiley Primary School. But when he wasn't hard at work in school, he and his older brother James would be running through the fields and playing games like soldiers and just having fun as kids would often do. When he got a little older, some of that playtime got cut short because Richard got his first job as a paper route. In 1950, Richard's mother moved with her 3 children here to Glendale, California. Richard would go on to graduate from Glendale High School in 1952 at the age of 17. In his mid-teen years, about the time he moved here, the Korean War broke out. And though it was near the end of the war, when Richard was old enough, he enlisted. He took up the call to serve and joined the Army, where he served in the clerk's office, doing all the clerical duties, including the important task of making passes for soldiers' R&R. After his enlistment in the service was complete, Richard would go to college before settling down to begin a family. During that time, Richard was blessed with the birth of his 6 children, and he worked hard to support his family. And work hard he did. Richard started working at the shopping bag grocery store in Sunland. Now, one thing about that grocery store, it would change names many times. It would change companies many times over the decades before eventually becoming a Vons. But through all of that change, through all of these name changes, there was one fixture in that store that never changed. For Richard was a meat cutter there for 38 years, right up to his retirement. And notice I said meat cutter because Richard hated the word butcher, and he would only refer to himself as a meat cutter, never a butcher. Though life would throw a couple curveballs his way over the years, little could Richard know that one greater blessing would come from his years at the grocery store. And they would come through a cashier who worked there by the name of Carol Johnson. They met at work, began dating, and fell in love. The rest is, as they say, history. From October 4th, 1975, Richard and Carol were married at her home in Tujunga. And off they went to enjoy a 2-day honeymoon to beautiful Santa Barbara. And that 2 days would really be quite special, but I'll tell you a little bit why later. After they were married, Richard and Carol moved to Sunland, where they would stay for the remainder of his life. But to really understand Richard and know what he was like, you need to know a little bit about his personality and some of his interests. You see, Richard was kind and funny and always had a story to share, especially a story about his youth. Just for fun, how many of you have ever heard a statement, "Give me 5 minutes," or something along the lines? Have any of you ever heard that saying from Richard? You know, no sooner would those words come out of his mouth than you knew you had to clear your calendar for the rest of the afternoon, because his stories would sometimes go for over an hour, story after story. Did he ever tell you the story about growing up and when he attended a memorial? If you have 5 minutes, I'll tell you. Maybe he liked to tell so many stories of his early years because at his core, Richard really was pretty old school in many ways. Richard would take a regular coffee anytime over one of those frilly Starbucks coffee drinks, and he would take a bound book to hold any day over an e-book on a Kindle or an iPad. Don't ask him to stop at an ATM because there was a perfectly fine teller inside the bank that he could go to. Richard liked tangible things. He wanted to be able to hold something in his hand. But as amazing as Richard was, and you know it's true because you all have countless memories of the amazing things that he did, you know that Richard was not perfect, though he was pretty close. He certainly had that other side to him as well. For example, 2 of his greatest vices were smoking and chocolate. Richard loved to smoke the Pall Mall menthol and would not quit for anyone. He was never going to quit, so don't even try. And Richard was a chocoholic. And you know his favorite addiction were those little chocolate-covered cherries. You could give him boxes and he would eat it. Even if he was given 15 boxes all at one time, each one was like a brand new gift, like a kid in a candy store, literally. He ate them all. But you can't talk about Richard and not talk about some of his loves. Nature, having a good time, traveling, and his family. See, first, Richard loved bird watching and being out in nature. The flora and the fauna. He would love to sit outside in the morning with his cup of coffee, listening to the sounds of nature. And birds really did hold his attention. In fact, Richard often liked to be outside just to feed the birds, even if it meant feeding a scrub jay from the palm of his hand. He loved nature, but he didn't like to hike so much. In fact, he didn't really like to walk, unless it was at Disneyland with the grandkids. Richard also loved to water the plants and the flowers, even if they weren't his directly. If I understand, there was one time Richard wanted to buy a purple sterling rose bush, the same as his daughter-in-law Kelly wanted. Unfortunately, his died, but hers still was alive and blooming. So he lived kind of vicariously through her, so to speak, because he really wanted to enjoy that rose bush. Every time he would visit, he'd look at the bush, take care of it, and even take clippings home with him just to enjoy that beautiful bush. Second, Richard loved to have a good time. Whether it was a holiday party, spending time with family, or playing chess or other games, or singing, which he was really good at. Maybe he got his inspiration for singing because he loved the Kingsman Trio. Third, Richard loved to go places. From the family trips to Solvang, San Diego, or the family outings to Santa Barbara, or spending time on the high seas enjoying a good cruise with family. Did you notice a running theme through all of those trips? There were always family outings. You see, with these trips, one thing was for certain. If you remember, I said the 2 days in Santa Barbara on the honeymoon was extra special because that was the one and only time that Carol and Richard got to enjoy a time alone without family on a trip. Every trip they took, everywhere they went, would involve one family member or another. But that was all right with Richard because he loved his family. And any who know him knows that he was all about his family. And his love for family, I think, is really what set Richard apart. You know, there's that old saying, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family. And part of his family he didn't get to pick. But I think if given the choice, Richard would have picked no other. However, Richard was also given that opportunity to pick a family a little later in life, and he picked a great one. For you were a blended family, but Richard claimed each of you as his own and never treated you any different. For Richard, it didn't matter if you were near or far, if you were extended family or immediate family, related by blood or by choice. Richard knew you as family, period. And that's why we're here, to recognize his love for you and your love for him. And that love ran deep to each and every one of you. For anything the family needed, Richard was there. And that love was shared not only with you, but the neighborhood kids as well that he would take in. To the 11 kids, you know how much he loved you, even if he might not have always said it. But sometimes, did you ever wonder if he had favorites? After all, he had 9 grandkids, 6 great-grandchildren with 2 more on the way. And you know, the older I get, I'm starting to realize this old saying, it's great to be a parent, but it's even greater to be a grandparent. You know, as a parent, you can spoil your kids, but you have to discipline them and everything. Well, when the grandparents come to see the kids and the great-grandkids, you realize that they're no longer there to see you. And the greatest joy of being a grandparent is you can spoil the grandkids even more. And you can get them hooked up on sugar and do whatever and spoil them every way you want. And what's the greatest blessing? You send them back to their parents. It's called payback. And I know Richard loved to spend his time with his great-grandson working in the yard. And he loved to watch all of the grandkids play. Even though we share stories of Richard's life. And we celebrate his memory and all of the things that he did and accomplished while he was alive, we know that even in all of these things, this isn't where we find the measure of his life. For it's not in accolades or accomplishments or physical attributes. It's not in the places that he lived or the adventures that he took. For these don't show the measure of Richard's life. As one anonymous poet wrote, we're not to ask how did he die, but how did he live? Not what did he gain, but what did he give? These are the units of the measure of the worth of a person as a person, regardless of birth. Not what was his church, nor what was his creed, but had he befriended those really in need? Was he ever ready with word of good cheer to banish a tear? Not what did the sketch in the newspaper say, but how many were sorry when he passed away? And for this, you don't need to look very far to find the answers to these questions. For you here today show the greatest measure of Richard's life. And I know he would consider himself to be the luckiest man to call each of you family and friends. For you are a testament to the measure of Richard's life. Richard was quite a man who leaves an amazing and wonderful legacy through the lives that were touched and made more complete on account of him. Though his body is gone, life will continue one day at a time. May you never forget, Richard, who left a deep and meaningful impression on your life. By carrying his memory with you, you show the measure of his life. And so on this day, we celebrate Richard's life and his lasting legacy, knowing that though you will never see him again face to face, though you will not enjoy family gatherings together, his memory will live on through you in your hearts. And through this, may you find hope and peace to experience God's grace and love to move forward one day at a time, never forgetting, but remembering and looking forward with joy and excitement that one day you will see Richard again, face to face, to hug him, to hold him, to take him by the hand and tell him yet again that you love him. I want to ask each of you to do something for a moment. If you'd be willing to close your eyes, and as you close your eyes, I want you to take a moment to picture Richard. Picture a time that you shared together, a word, a memory, a trip, whatever it might be. But take a moment to remember this. Did you do it? Did you see his face once more? Did you share that memory, that laugh, that smile? As times are tough, and as his memory continues on, may you hold fast to those times to bring a smile to your face. I believe that Richard would want that.